I'm going to chair this seminar. But before starting, I invite Steve and I to say a couple of words about the Depot project and this first series of workshops.
Thanks, Gilda. So the project is a 7-year project funded by the main Canadian Funding Council, and it's a transnational project that brings together major research centers, trade unions, industrial museums, labor archives, and other partners from 6 different countries, 4 in Europe and 2 in North America. And one of the goals is to really think about the politics of deindustrialization. And there's a lot of media coverage around the possible connection between sort of right-wing populism and deindustrialized areas, but not a lot of research. And so that's one of the key elements. But we're also very interested in sort of issues of the environment, gender, race more generally, and so on. The project, once COVID's over, knock on wood, the idea is to have annual conferences that bring not only our team members together, but also the wider community of specialists on deindustrialization and race and so on, to really chew on these issues, as well as a summer institute for students, so that the next generation of researchers are really a transnational generation. And we'll have a series of books that will come out. And the capstone will be both a collectively authored volume that tries to encapsulate what we've learned, but also a transnational exhibition. So an exhibition that has anchored in many different museums in many different countries that ties sort of the transnational issues to the local issues. And our project's very invested in oral history. And so we don't want to sort of scale up while losing that connection to lived realities. And so we're very keen on working across those scale. And so that's essentially the project. And this series is we just started in the summer. And this series is meant to sort of think about sort of the key words, the concepts that emerge to help explain, the economic changes underway. And of course, concepts are, emerge in context. And so they have different meanings, and there's different languages, but different meanings within those languages in different countries. And so it's about trying to connect, and work across these divides, particularly Italian, German, French, and English, and the scholarships and so on. So that's essentially, is that okay, Gilda?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Before starting with the presentation, some practical things, practical information. We are going to listen 7 presentations by team members of Depot, the Industrialization and the Politics of Our Time. And each speaker will be given 7 minutes, maximum 8 for their contribution. And when 1 minute is left, I will show this sign. So please give a look to my box. This strict timing allows us to have a quite long question and answer session, which is, I think, something interesting and important. For the audience, please save your questions for the end, clicking raise hand button. Or you can also share your questions in the chat during the presentations, and Lauren La Framboise is helping us with technical problems and in gathering the comments, the questions for the second part of the seminar. Last 2 things, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and note that this session will be recorded, but just for archival purposes, and only the speakers' presentations will be shared publicly at a later date. Okay, everything is clear. Okay, thank you. This is the first time in my life I chair in English, so please forgive me for my mistakes. And if you see me panicking, Lauren and Steve, you can take the situation on your hands. The first presenter is Professor Tim Strangleman. He's a sociologist of work at the Kent University in England, and we are all ears for you, Tim. You can unmute yourself, and I start my stopwatch as soon as you start speaking.
Right, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's right. So I've got that on there. Okay, look at that lovely, see, there's a kind of rust thing going on there. Right, okay, so I was thinking quite really sort of builds on what I've been talking about for a long time, and I know some of you would have seen my diagrams before, but I'll just bear with me for a second. So one of the reasons I got into deindustrialization is through history and through transition. As a sociologist, I'm interested in transition, and E.P. Thompson's famous Making English Working Class is interested in taking pre-industrial societies and the way their culture and politics was formed in and through industrialization to create an industrial working class. And I know some of you would have seen this. So what I tried to do is think of Thompson's interest and map it onto our interest in the other end, if you like, the bookend of industrial society in the West, at least, recognizing China would be in here and would be an interesting case study where you put it. But if you think that's Thompson's interest there, the pre-industrial into the industrial, and that what's going on in that vector, then I should have paid more attention at school. And then what I'm interested in here is the relationship between industrial and deindustrial society, if indeed you can conceptualize it. So this is a theoretical model, but the point is to try and populate it, I think. But I wanted to try and clarify and do it, and I've been working on this for a long time. I showed it in the Montreal conference that Stephen organized some time ago. And what I'm interested in here is I think it helps to think through what we're kind of developing thinking here, because if you think we're in the process of, we're in the event of deindustrialization, what then comes next is the kind of open-ended question. So if you think that pre-industrial society was embedded, to use Polanyi's terms, then we have a process of disembedding with the entry into industrial society. People, workers get embedded, and then deindustrialized society is a process again of disembedding, and then is it possible to be embedded in deindustrialized society? And then using Jerry Lincoln's idea of the half-life of deindustrialization, when's that half-life over? Can we talk of that? So that's where I'm coming from. When was deindustrialization, I think, is a very important point to make, picking up on Steve's concepts emerging in context. Are we talking about deindustrialization now? I think certainly in terms of the politics, right-wing populist politics, we can talk about that. Or are we talking about the classic period, 1970s, 1980s, decline of the Rust Belt, particularly in the States? Are we talking about the 1960s? Certainly there's evidence in many industrializing economies of deindustrialization going on as early as that. Are we talking about post-war Germany and the kind of coining of the phrase of deindustrialization? Are we talking about the interwar period and the book Constantine Confronting Decline is certainly a study in interwar deindustrialization? Are we talking about 19th century deindustrialization? This book by Johnson and his work, Industrial Languedoc, mapping deindustrialization certainly in the 19th century, and if not before. And then my own, where I work in Canterbury, people have used, classic scholars have used the term deindustrialization to map, to think about when the Romans left and the industry declined. So my project at the moment that is forming up, hopefully will form part of the Depot wider project, is I'm interested in historiography of the term deindustrialization and the ways in which, certainly in the UK, scholars started to talk about it. And I think you can start seeing that in the UK from the 1960s onwards, the way scholars were talking about it, using the term, certainly from the 1970s onwards. And what I'm interested in, how academics and intellectuals make sense of closure, but also how workers make sense of closure. Are we just talking about isolated closure and change and loss, or are we talking about something that is seen to be a permanent shift in the way we live? So I'm interested in that kind of the actuality, the experience, but also the language of industrial loss. So the question, I think, is when does closure, loss, or an ending of something tip into what we would call deindustrialization? I think it's a really interesting set of ideas, because you can see that closure always happens, but then all of a sudden we're into some new sort of territory. And I think I can see in the UK, certainly there are intimations towards that in the 1970s. Certainly the way academics, economists, sociologists started using the term deindustrialization is certainly present there, but they do it self-consciously. And of course, it's a political term. My friend Jack Metzger wrote a lot about, as a union activist, trying to stop people using the term deindustrialization because it was so political, because it almost ceded ground, literally or metaphorically, to those who would say that we need to move to the tertiary economy. So, so deindustrialization is a loss of, to define it as a loss of industry or sector, as a political or economic process. But equally, I'm interested in it as a cultural moment. And that idea in my work that I've tried to use and others have used as an industrial or a deindustrial structure of feeling. So we're almost talking about here deindustrialization as a moment. And by moment, I mean something that is experienced over decades. It's not really a moment. But I'm trying to pick up on how people articulate this sense of loss and try and peel it out from industrial closures, which have always happened. So just very quickly, I think this is the last slide, Gilda, don't worry. So really what I'm trying to do here is populate this slide. So if you think about this as a very, very abstract theoretical model, I've just been teaching Parsons. I love this. This is actually too empirical. It's too time reliant. But what I'm trying to do is this. I think I'm interested in this period, this borderline between when we're ticking along as an industrial society, and then all of a sudden we're there. What's going on there? And then more broadly, I think we're all interested in what's going on here, if that makes sense. So I think I'll end it there. And how's that for timing, Gilda?
Yeah, perfect timing. Perfect timing.
Brilliant. Great. I did want to see your sign, but I didn't see it. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I did it. Maybe Lauren, when you see me doing this, you can send maybe a message in the chat. I did it.
Oh,
yes.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Gilda. Sorry.
No, you didn't even need it.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah. Yes, please. Thank you very much, Tim. And I will hand it over to Stefan Berger, who is Professor of Social History and Director of the Institute for Social Movement at the Ruhr University of Bochum, Germany. Please, Stefan, do you have visual to share?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I thought I'll talk a little bit about something I'm working on at the moment, which is an article on nostalgia and the use of nostalgia in memories of deindustrialization and memories of industrial societies. Basically, it sort of derives from an article I did in a special issue that I edited together with Stephen High on deindustrial societies for the North American journal Labor, Studies in Working Class History, where I already looked at the idea of nostalgic memory in the deindustrialization of the Ruhr in Germany, specifically examining the regional history museum of the Ruhr in Essen at the World Heritage Site of Zeche Zollverein. But what I want to do in this article, which is for a German journal and will be published in German, is to look more closely at the relationship of nostalgic memory to different regimes of memory. And I'm interested here in exploring to what extent we can use theories in memory studies, in particular the theory of agonistic memory that is associated with the work of Anna Cento-Bull and Hans-Lauge Hansen, who wrote an article on agonistic memory in Memory Studies in 2016. Whether we can use this theory of agonistic memory to understand what goes on in deindustrialization memories, and in particular how nostalgia is used in those memories of deindustrialization. There's been a lot of literature on nostalgia. I'm sure you will be familiar with some of that. And there has been for many years now a backlash against this idea of nostalgia always being backwards looking, always being conservative or reactionary, sort of furthering a kind of antiquarianism in the Nietzschean sense. And there has been a lot more emphasis on nostalgia being forward-looking, underpinning a whole host of progressive and radical movements in the past. So the understanding of nostalgia has been changing, I think, over recent years. And if we look at this theory of agonistic memory, then it differentiates between three different forms of memory: antagonistic memory, cosmopolitan memory, and agonistic memory. Now, antagonistic memory has a clear differentiation between them and an us, and it works very much through identification with the us. It works through the passions of identifying with the community of the us. It is very monologic. It is not reflexive. And the classical form of antagonistic memory, I guess, is kind of nationalist memory. But if we try and transfer this to the area of deindustrialization, then I would see classic forms of antagonistic memory as memory that, on the one hand, refer to deindustrialization as almost a kind of force of nature against which there is no opposition possible. The memory is one which sees the process of deindustrialization as a necessary one. And therefore the protagonists of achieving that are seen in positive terms, and anything that is opposing deindustrialization is seen in negative terms. The second memory regime, cosmopolitan memory, is one that is also working through binaries, through an us and a them. But here, the us is usually very much the community of victims, victims of violence, and the them are the perpetrators. Traditionally, this kind of memory regime is very much associated with anti-totalitarianism, and it works through compassion with the victims of violence. It's highly self-reflective. It is also multi-perspectival, but the multi-perspectivity and the dialogic nature of cosmopolitan memory is working within the framework of deliberative democracy towards consensus. And once that consensus is reached, anyone who stands out of that consensus does not participate in the debate anymore. So cosmopolitan memory has effectively been depoliticizing memory. If we translate this to the realm of deindustrialization studies, then I would say that this kind of memory is very much one which identifies with the victims of deindustrialization, i.e. largely the kind of workers who have been suffering under deindustrialization, whose norms and values have been under threat, whose whole life worlds have been under threat. Now, the third regime of memory, agonistic memory, is not working through binaries. It is trying instead to radically historicize the past and to lead to an understanding of different groups, victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and through this radical historicization to try and understand better the kind of historical processes and the memory processes that are at work both in the past and in the present. But agonistic memory in this model is also a form of memory that takes a very specific political stance. The theory of agonistic memory, as formulated by Bull and Hansen, takes its inspiration from the political theorist Chantal Mouffe. And Mouffe's idea of agonistic memory is one which clearly sides with a kind of anti-capitalist left in global perspective. And as such, also agonistic memory is very much siding with this left. It works through the passions of solidarity of people, and it is very much aimed at giving a voice to the people who, it argues, have been made voiceless through a kind of cosmopolitan consensus of the past. Now, if we look at nostalgia, I think nostalgia, both in cosmopolitan memory and in agonistic memory, very much works through compassion with the victims. But I think in one sense, it leads to a kind of policy from above, which is aiming at taking care of the victims, which would be the kind of cosmopolitan form of memory, whereas the agonistic form of memory is working at enabling agency of the people from below, and therefore they operate according to very different logics. And what I will try to do in the article is to relate these different forms of nostalgic memory to different processes of deindustrialization in global perspective. And as Gilda has just shown me the 1 minute sign, let me just briefly outline. I have divided this into 4 different case studies. One, the market-driven neoliberal forms of deindustrialization, of which I take the United States and Britain as key examples. One, the kind of West European, more corporative-driven forms of deindustrialization, where I look at Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. The third sample will be post-communist forms of deindustrialization, where I look at Poland and Hungary. And then the fourth will be deindustrialization processes in the global south, where I will look in particular at China and Mexico, and see how these forms of nostalgic memory associated with both cosmopolitan and agonistic forms of memory work. And I think that's all that I will have time for in my 7 minutes. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Stefan, and sorry to cut you off. I hate this role, but I have to do it. And now is the time for Jackie Clarke, another member of the group, and she's a senior lecturer in French studies and co-director of the Centre for Gender History at the University of Glasgow, Scotland. And please, Jackie. Thanks. And give a look to my face.
Always. I will be eagle-eyed. I'll try not to look at the piece of paper in front of me too much. Yes, well, as Gilda has indicated, I'm based in Scotland, but I research and write about France. And I'm also, I guess, just to situate myself, I'm coming from a perspective of, I guess, a social cultural historian with quite a strong kind of cultural take, usually in the kinds of things that I do. So it's from that perspective that I speak. So I'm just going to make there's sort of two main things, I guess, that I want to say, two main observations. And the first is about how deindustrialization is understood differently between the UK or Scotland and France. I'm kind of trying to sort of begin to think about that transnational perspective. And the second is about, relates to some of the things that Tim has talked about around how we sort of conceptualize deindustrialization from sort of different sort of disciplinary perspectives in more kind of social, cultural ways and so on. Okay, so the first thing I'll say is that the chronology of deindustrialization is different in the UK and France, and this has inflected understandings of what deindustrialization actually is as a process. The decline in industrial employment starts earlier in the UK, as Tim hinted, you know, something that's already visible in the 1960s, and it's accelerated in the 1980s under Thatcherism. So there's this big policy shift in the 1980s away from a sort of managed approach to deindustrialization, the kind of moral economy. I'm thinking of work of my colleagues, Jim Phillips and Jim Tomlinson, who've really kind of marked this kind of shift, this ideological rupture of the 1980s. And this has tended to mean that in the UK context, and especially in Scotland perhaps, the 80s are really seen as the privileged moment of deindustrialization. So at least until Brexit happened, I think, there was a tendency to see deindustrialization in the public imagination almost like an event, a finished process, a thing that happened in the 80s. As if, you know, we got to somewhere in the mid-90s, we all watched the full Monty, we elected Tony Blair, and that was us done. In France, the situation is quite different. Deindustrialization has been understood in France as a more ongoing and protracted process, I think. The fall in numbers and the fall in the proportion of people employed in industrial jobs in France starts later. And although there is an ideological realignment in the 1980s that's apparent in some ways in France too, there isn't the radical policy break that you get in the UK with Thatcherism. And actually, if there's a moment in France where there is a kind of prise de conscience and a kind of heightened public debate about deindustrialization, it's actually in the first decade of the 21st century, arguably. So deindustrialization in some ways is understood, I think, in France as something that is happening now and not as a finished event. These are two very different perspectives. And one of the consequences of that is that the French debate has been heavily marked by the presence of another keyword for which we don't really have a very direct English equivalent, and that is the word délocalisation, which figured very heavily in the kind of debates of the early 2000s. Délocalisation is the offshoring of production, so the factory being kind of packed up and production being shipped to Poland or wherever. And that focus has meant that the French debate has been much more inflected by debates about globalized production versus national production, with sort of certain political consequences, I guess, of that framing. So that's my first sort of set of reflections around France versus the UK. And I guess kind of picking up on this question of temporalities and that Tim has referred to, and answering one of the questions we were sort of asked to think about a little bit was ways in which the term deindustrialization has been contested and why we think it's still a useful term. And I think one of the ways in which that term has been contested is, well, there's lots of different ways, but I think one of the things that the more sort of critical views have tended to have in common is the suggestion that the term focuses too much on what has been lost, rather than on, you know, why industrial jobs have gone, or what's wrong with the jobs that replaced them, right? You know, rather than focusing on thinking about the nature of the service sector or precarity or whatever it is, that we're busy thinking about, you know, some kind of previous industrial order. That would be one of the criticisms. Again, the accusation of being backward looking. And these concerns are linked, I think, this criticism is linked to the tendency I've mentioned to see deindustrialization as a finished process. And if we think of deindustrialization in narrowly economic terms, simply as a shift in employment patterns, that might also reinforce the tendency to see it as a more or less complete process. But I guess I want to argue we should see deindustrialization as a much more multidimensional process than that. It's economic, but it's also social, it's spatial, it's cultural. You know, we talk about industrial societies and industrial cultures. So how are those things reordered in the deindustrialization process? How are working class cultures or industrial masculinities deindustrialized? So my understanding of deindustrialization includes these long-term processes of social and cultural reordering, which I think have a different kind of temporality, perhaps, from some of the purely economic phenomena. And I think that once you understand things from that perspective, it's quite difficult to see deindustrialization as an event or something that's finished. And studying deindustrialization from this perspective then is not just about what has been lost. Thanks, Gilda. I'm actually at my last sentence. It's about an ongoing process, and an ongoing process that I think is quite critical to our understanding of the politics of our time. And that is me.
Thanks a lot. You have finished 20 seconds earlier. You have a super bonus.
I have, well, I've got exactly what I need in my video filters because I've got a halo.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Which I'll put on
Thank you very much, Jackie. And now it's the turn of Dimitry Anastakis. He has share screen to prepare. And Dimitry is a business historian at the University of Toronto, Canada. And thank you for your speech.
Thank you. That's great. Do I get Jackie's 20 extra seconds? Because I'll take them if I can get them. But in the short time I have, I want to do a couple of things. First, I want to highlight what I see are some of the developments in the North American deindustrialization literature, how it's evolved over time. And along the way, I want to drop in a few comments about how the political discourse around deindustrialization has also evolved. I'm going to be looking at some representative selections in the academic scholarship and making some commentary, which I think makes sense given our research network's look at the politics of this issue. The other thing I want to do, along with talking about the literature and how it's kind of worked with popular discourse, is I want to make a few comments about how I think a deindustrialization may go in the future, at least in my work, and some departure points about how we can think about deindustrialization more broadly. Now, before I begin, I want to say it's actually really a challenge to say anything interesting or even new when you're on a panel with a bunch of deindustrialization experts, including Stephen High, because basically everything I know about deindustrialization I got from reading his books. So, you know, I'm going to try my best here, but it is important, I think, to kind of do a little bit of a review, since it's important to get a sense of the broad contours of North American deindustrialization scholarship. And some of the comments I'm going to make have already been spoken to a little bit by Tim and by Jackie. So as we all know, the first kind of wave of deindustrialization scholarship, let me just switch here. The first wave of deindustrialization scholarship in North America really emerged after that you know, great wave in the 1970s of automotive closures, rubber closures, steel closures in the American Midwest. And during this period, one of the main themes of the literature in the public discourse, especially in the United States, was the idea of the runaway plant thesis, which was this notion that, you know, American corporations were sending all their jobs and their factories overseas. The classic expression of this, of course, was Barry Bluestone's book on the deindustrialization of North America, which really spoke to this issue. It came out, I think the first version was in 1982. Now, in the period after the great tsunami of closures, as Professor Hai refers to him, there were a number of broader assessments of what deindustrialization meant over the next 20 or 30 years. And over time, most of the analysis shifted from a kind of look at the causes of deindustrialization to one that was much more focused on the consequences of deindustrialization. And most of the literature really was coming from within the discipline from social historians, labor historians, and used a lot of the new techniques from that part of our profession, oral history and stuff like that, which is so important to our project here, looking at the impact upon ordinary people and communities. So we see this in a few of these representative books here, Cowie and Heathcote's book. Beyond the Ruins was an attempt to look at a lot of aspects of deindustrialization, including its chronology, the politics around deindustrialization, and it was a mix of themed essays and cases as well. Then, there was Hai's book in 2003, which was a great departure because it looked at deindustrialization from national perspectives as opposed to focusing solely on local communities, and brought a cross-border North American approach, which was a real departure from what a lot of the literature had been looking at. And by the last 30 or 40 years, there's been such a buildup in terms of the literature that we have books like Lyndon's book, which really is a kind of overview of the literature in terms of how it's been shaped over time. So there's a lot of good work that does look at broader themes around deindustrialization and literature. Moving on, obviously, even as this kind of thematic approach was developing, we saw a lot of case studies and theme studies that focused on individual factories or certain towns or certain regions or certain sectors of the economy. And a lot of the popular discourse around this period really was moving away from the runaway plant thesis. There wasn't yet an embrace of looking at foreign competition or globalization, which hadn't yet become a major theme, but started to in the 1990s. From the Canadian perspective, a lot of the critics of deindustrialization often took a nationalist framing as opposed to a local framing, arguing that the runaway distinction was Canadian branch plant operations being pulled back to the United States, which was a key cause of deindustrialization from the Canadian perspective. Now, in all of these studies, all the case studies, theme studies, the focus has been on the actions of corporations, the actions of states, and of course upon unions, workers, and communities. And there's been more of an emphasis on the latter, upon unions, communities, and workers, in part because most of the research has been developed by labor historians and social historians. You can see that as well in this ongoing literature review, where you see a lot of case studies that started to bring in different aspects, not just workers, worker agency and unions, but issues like race, local foci on different places, a lot of community analysis. So this is kind of a pretty admittedly rudimentary review, but I just want to take a quick moment to say that, in the last little period, there's been a real departure in terms of analyzing different approaches, looking at corporations and their motives, looking at the chronology of when deindustrialization started and how we understand it, looking at aspects like trade as being an important part of deindustrialization discussion, not just workers and communities, but trade agreements. And of course, going to that next phase of deindustrialization and looking at issues that really move beyond this phase. So the last 2 points I want to quickly make are that, one thing that in my own work, and I think that a lot of what the network is trying to do, is that we really do need to broaden our view of this entire process. And this speaks a little bit to what Jackie was saying. In terms of thinking about deindustrialization as more of a continuum than an end game. i.e., there's lots of ways to think about industrialization, deindustrialization, reindustrialization, and ongoing industrialization, and the conflict and battle and balance between those issues as something that we need to focus upon. And a great example is what's going on in Ontario right now. We know that Oshawa's General Motors plants are all closed, but we just got news that there's going to be a reindustrialization of Ford's plants in Oakville and Chrysler's plants in Windsor. So we need to think more broadly about the process of deindustrialization as one that's working on a continuum. And I suspect that, which leads to my last point, that really emerges from my disciplinary perspective as a business historian, where I'm committed to looking at deindustrialization in as broad a range as possible in terms of looking at state actors and corporate actors, which all of us are doing. But I think it's really important to start thinking about stuff like how the discourse around trade agreements in the last phase of the popular discourse has really influenced how people think about deindustrialization, thinking about broader concepts of neoliberalism and speaking to deindustrialization. This requires a kind of conscious effort for us to really broaden our view and how we think about these issues. I'm sorry for going over time. Thank you.
No, you've been perfect. Just 15 seconds more, those that were left from Jackie. So perfect. Thank you very much, Dimitry. Please close your share screen. And now it's the time for Stephen. And Stephen doesn't need to be presented here, I think, and is a professor of history and founder of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling at Concordia University, Montreal, other than the principal investigator of the DEPOT team.
Thanks, Gilda. Well, at the risk of repeating what others have already said, I'll begin by saying that deindustrialization is a process of physical and social ruination, as well as part of a wider political project that leaves working class communities impoverished and demoralized. I think it's really important to forefront that point. Economically, deindustrialization refers to a widespread systematic disinvestment in the productive capacity of a country, region, or locality. Politically, deindustrialization goes beyond mere description to offer an explanation as well, shining a harsh light on the dark corners of corporate decision-making. I've written about this before, the deindustrialization thesis as such, right, first emerged in the early 1970s here in Canada, when it became the rallying cry of left nationalists who believed that the United States under President Nixon was pursuing an American first policy of repatriating US manufacturing jobs. The deindustrialization of Canada was thus blamed on capital flight, much as Dimitry was saying, and on US foreign direct investment. Within a decade, however, this thesis was adopted in the United States, where it morphed into a struggle between capital and community. There, the political emphasis was placed on absentee rather than foreign ownership for obvious reasons. In their classic book, The Deindustrialization of America, Bluestone and Harrison argued that deindustrialization does not just happen. Conscious decisions have to be made by corporate managers to move a factory from one location to another, to buy a going concern or dispose of it, or to shut down a facility altogether. This conceptualization of the problem was also forged in political struggle, as Bluestone and Harrison's study was actually commissioned by a coalition of groups resisting factory closures. Their explanation served to counter those arguing that plant closings signaled a bright new post-industrial future or bright new post-industrial tomorrow. It's another reminder that categories are not neutral terms, but are rather the result of historical struggle. How we understand these devastating economic changes very much depends on where we look. Deindustrialization studies as a field of research has focused almost exclusively on single industry towns and cities located in heartland areas where nothing has filled the economic vacuum. Recognized industrial heartlands almost always congeal around male proletarians in industries that are considered central to the nation. Auto, steel, mining have all therefore received more than their fair share of attention. Industries that employed women were considered peripheral by comparison and were therefore more readily written off and forgotten. A significantly different understanding of economic change has prevailed on the resource frontier in North America, at least. In hinterland areas like my home region of Northern Ontario, the boom to bust cycle, so this idea of boom to bust, that it's cyclical rather than structural, provide an explanation for economic hard times based on wildly fluctuating commodity prices, resource exhaustion, and economic dependency. Until recently, this cyclical pattern of rise and decline favored a regionalist or hinterland framing of the problem rather than a critique of capitalism itself. The recent closure of hundreds of paper mills and sawmills across North America in the last 20 years has made it clear that these areas are now experiencing outright deindustrialization. So we're hearing very little of this boom and bust talk these days. Now, metropolitan cities that have seemingly, at least, made the post-industrial transition have also been largely overlooked by deindustrialization scholars. This is not surprising, as the economic vacuum appeared to be quickly filled. For the most part, an urban studies framing has privileged where people live rather than where they worked. Economic dislocation has therefore taken a backseat to the residential displacements of urban renewal and gentrification. In the United States, at least, the urban crisis of the 1960s and 70s was understood in highly racialized terms. This urban framing renders visible the actions of the state and gentrifiers, but renders invisible the actions of private capital, letting corporations off the political hook. This is even true of gentrification studies, which has focused primarily on middle-class gentrifiers rather than on the lived experiences of poor, often deindustrialized residents who are being forcibly dispossessed from their homes. It represents a significant gap in research. Urban scholar Tom Slater has been particularly critical of gentrification studies, arguing that it has largely failed to integrate working class experiences into its analysis. He laments the demise of displacement as a core concept in the field and the disguising of gentrification as part of an improved, mixité sociale or social mix. This is where the field of deindustrialization studies has much to offer, given the centrality of working class people and the concept of forced displacement in its analysis. I'd like to end my presentation by saying I've come to see a disparity in how we approach different forms of violence and the moral claims of its victims. As Rob Nixon shows in his book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, violence is customarily conceived of as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular in space, and as erupting into instant sensational visibility. However, the structural violence of deindustrialization is a slow violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction, and it's dispersed across time and space. An attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Pervasive non- or derecognition of class-based violence, compounded by the disinclination of middle-class people to contest the divided nature of capitalism, has produced, to quote Jackie Clarke, new forms of working class invisibility. Conceptually, deindustrialization renders visible working class people and the enormous pain that has been inflicted on them over the past generation. As anthropologist, I'll end with this, as anthropologist Kathy Stanton once wrote, Deindustrialization is a history that is so vast, so unfinished, and so woven into the present on virtually every level of our lives that it seems unimaginable to me that anyone can think of it as history or past. I think these are really important words, that it's unfinished. It's exactly what Jackie and everyone else has been saying. I'll end there. I had more to say, but I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen. And we have the last two presentations. Now is the time of Xavier Vigna, and he has been allowed to speak in French extraordinarily. And Xavier is a labor historian at the University of Paris-Nanterre. À toi.
Merci. Bonjour. Donc oui, on m'a autorisé à parler français. Je vais essayer, dans le temps dont je dispose, de rebondir sur ce qu'a dit Stephen, Jackie et Tim en particulier, à propos de la France. Alors, si on regarde la production historiographique en France, on constate que le terme désindustrialisation apparaît dans les années 70. En fait, j'ai cherché dans les catalogues de la Bibliothèque nationale et la première occurrence du mot, c'est 1975, dans des travaux où on raisonne à partir du cas de Paris et du cas de Lyon, j'y reviendrai, pour signaler la disparition d'un certain nombre d'installations industrielles et des reconfigurations. Bon. Les études commencent à se multiplier véritablement à partir des années 80, mais Le Monde, le journal Le Monde, qui est le grand journal français, la première fois qu'il utilise le terme désindustrialisation au sens où on doit le regarder ensemble, c'est en janvier 1979. Donc, ça rejoint ce que disait Jackie, c'est-à-dire que la perception en France, elle est véritablement à partir de la seconde moitié des années 70. Bon, ça, c'était ma première remarque. Deuxième remarque, le terme désindustrialisation, je crois qu'on peut le connecter à un certain nombre d'autres termes pour les mettre en regard. Premier terme historiquement qu'il faut mettre en regard, c'est décentralisation. Parce que, alors je ne sais pas les équivalents anglais de décentralisation, mais c'est à partir de 1955 que le gouvernement français a organisé la désindustrialisation de la région parisienne. Et il l'a présenté comme une décentralisation et comme une chose positive. Parce que ça, c'est important. C'est-à-dire que le mot désindustrialisation, que nous, on voit comme quelque chose, un processus terrible, épouvantable, etc., a été présenté à un certain moment comme des choses positives. J'y reviendrai. Deuxième point, deuxième couple de termes avec lesquels on peut les mettre en rapport, c'est modernisation ou tertiarisation. S'il y a moins d'industrie, il y a plus de secteurs tertiaires. Et ce phénomène de basculement est présenté parfois comme un point de vue, une évolution positive et souhaitable. Bon. Et là aussi, il y a des applications politiques et symboliques extrêmement importantes. Bon. Troisième terme à mettre en regard, c'était un peu ce que disait Stephen, c'est-à-dire que désindustrialisation, c'est aussi une désouvriérisation. Il y a moins d'ouvriers. Bon, voilà. Alors, ce qui est compliqué à comprendre et qu'il faut articuler, c'est le fait qu'à la fois, on a moins d'ouvriers et que ces ouvriers n'ont plus les mêmes métiers. En France, alors je ne sais pas, là aussi, il faudrait faire des comparaisons entre pays, la manière dont on compte les activités professionnelles. Parce qu'en France, on peut être ouvrier, on peut être classé comme ouvrier sans travailler dans l'industrie. Et ça aussi, c'est très important. C'est-à-dire que, parce que dans l'imaginaire collectif, ouvrier égale industrie, et dans les statistiques publiques, les ouvriers sont de moins en moins dans l'industrie et de plus en plus font du travail de services, de logistique et des choses comme ça. Et là aussi, ça veut dire que pour le monde ouvrier qui se vivait comme un monde industriel et où sa réalité aujourd'hui est celle du secteur des services, il n'y a pas de représentation possible. Si j'ai le temps, j'en dirai un mot. Et quatrième élément comme le disait Jackie Clarke tout à l'heure, c'est la délocalisation. Mais j'y reviendrai. Voilà. Donc, il y a tous ces univers de sens-là dans lesquels le phénomène prend sens. Alors, ça a une série de conséquences. Ça a, à mon avis, 4 ou 5 séries de conséquences. D'un point de vue politique d'abord, ce phénomène de violence dont parlait Stephen, il me semble qu'il faut aussi prendre la mesure du fait que les pouvoirs publics, au moins en France, l'ont en partie organisé. En effet, alors pour 2 raisons. D'abord parce qu'il y a un abandon de toute politique industrielle en France à partir du début des années 80, et parce que ça renvoie, et c'est un point, je pense, où on peut se retrouver avec Stephen, c'est-à-dire que ça renvoie aussi à l'idée que, l'industrie, c'est ancien, c'est vieux, et les ouvriers, c'est un monde, c'est une classe sociale qui ne compte pas beaucoup, ou qui compte moins et dont il faut se méfier, avec une dimension communiste, et qui fait que cette classe ouvrière, finalement, si elle disparaît, c'est plutôt une bonne chose. Bon, évidemment, ça provoque des drames, mais si ça disparaît, c'est quand même une bonne chose. Bon. Je crois que là, il y a un point à souligner, et alors, qu'il faudrait articuler avec la question environnementale. Parce que, à partir d'un certain moment, et peut-être que là aussi c'est les années 70, je ne sais pas, mais la disparition de l'industrie va être présentée comme la disparition de sources de pollution, et donc comme une évolution favorable. C'est-à-dire que la désindustrialisation, là aussi, c'est une modernisation technologique qui va supprimer des sources de pollution, et donc c'est une bonne chose. Et ça explique des relations très, très conflictuelles en France entre les groupes ouvriers qui subissent la désindustrialisation et le mouvement écologiste. Bon. Deuxième point sur lequel je voudrais insister, c'est la question des territoires de la désindustrialisation. Parce que là aussi, Stephen l'a dit, c'est-à-dire qu'on raisonne soit à l'échelle locale, soit à l'échelle nationale. Mais en fait, alors pour la France, ça me semble important de signaler que les régions les plus affectées par la désindustrialisation, c'est ce qu'en français on appelle la province. Terme qui n'a pas de traduction véritablement dans les langues étrangères. C'est-à-dire des régions périphériques. Ce n'est pas le cœur du pays. C'est pas le cœur du pays. Et donc, ça compte moins. Et là, de ce fait-là encore, ça rejoint ce que disait Jackie sur l'invisibilisation. C'est-à-dire que la disparition la disparition et les drames sociaux générés par la disparition de ces groupes ouvriers, on ne les voit pas depuis Paris. Et donc, on les accepte d'autant plus facilement. Ça, je crois que c'est un point qui mérite d'être souligné. Quatrièmement, oui, j'ai vu, ok, je me dépêche. Quatrièmement, comme le disait Jackie, c'est en liaison avec les délocalisations. Juste un point là-dessus, qui est très important. La construction européenne s'est faite sur le charbon et l'acier. En France, il n'y a plus de charbon et l'acier appartient à une entreprise indienne qui est Mittal. Et donc, de ce fait-là, cette désindustrialisation a légitimé une hostilité envers une construction européenne qui apparaît comme une perte de souveraineté et une destruction de l'appareil productif. Dernière chose, d'un point de vue symbolique, cette désindustrialisation a contribué à supprimer tout le mouvement ouvrier, à la suppression, à la disparition de tout porte-parole. Les porte-paroles du mouvement ouvrier ont disparu ou ont été menacés. Et ce monde ouvrier se vit comme des survivants, menacés, sans porte-parole, sans parole publique. Et ça rend la situation politique extrêmement instable et dangereuse. J'ai fini.
Merci beaucoup, Xavier. Thank you. And it's my turn. I'm going to share my screen. I don't have any particularly clever presentation, but I did it. And here we go. Can you see it? Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes. I'm going to check my time too. Okay. Okay. within this team, I think I represent a country where what you and we familiarly call deindustrialization studies are at the earlier embryonic stage. And so in my 7-minute presentation, I have decided to focus on this. And I think the main reason is that the very notion of a deindustrialization of Italy is still controversial, disputed. Recently, I tried to go ahead with my presentation, but it doesn't work. Why? Oh, sorry. Okay. Recently, 2 colleagues have written about a strong dissociation between the impact of the phenomenon and its perception. And I totally agree. I think this is the right starting point, but it clearly entails that we have a preliminary problem to understand this gap between reality and perception. And to do so, we should overcome a sort of dialogue of the deaf that I would very roughly simplify like this. Mr. A asserts Italy is still an industrial nation, as a calling, as a vocation to manufacturing, that's a common expression in public debate, performs productive excellences. At the very end, Italy is the 2nd industrial country of Europe and the 7th of the globe. And Mr. B gently replies, yes, you're right, but Italy is also a deindustrialized country. Quantitative figures and economic trends, places and landscapes, popular culture and labor memory, even arts and literature can prove that. So we are caught between 2 matter-of-facts and 2 corresponding national self-narratives, but the second voice has been for a long time overlooked or whispered. An eminent business historian used to write that deindustrialization in Italy was an imported specter, was a stereotype. So why has it been and somehow still is so difficult to recognize deindustrialization as part of the same picture of changing labor and society? There are, I think, historical reasons. Recognizing deindustrialization as a structural change, as a permanent change, is particularly troubling for a latecomer industrial nation, where industrialism has been a backbone of the ruling class and the union trade union movement, and where industrialization has been viewed as the way to overcome the painful north-south divide, and a country where the social memory of mass unemployment, underemployment, and mass immigration is still potent and alive. And in relation to this point, I'm going to mention only one specific place where a toxic continuity of the industrialist ideology of the past and the missing recognition of the industrialization processes of the present is dramatically palpable. And the place is the city of Taranto in the southern region of Puglia. Taranto is the Italian steel town. The steel plant was built by the state in the 1960s, and it was privatized in the 1990s. Now is ArcelorMittal too. And what was conceived to save the region from poverty turned out to be a carnage for the workers and public health and the environment. It's really sad to say, but Taranto is exactly cancer in place of anger. And today, Taranto is at the same time the biggest steel plant of Europe and a community that went through deep processes of downsizing and restructuring. So Taranto experiences the condition of being, as it was defined by an outstanding observer, Alessandro Leogrande, a sort of Italian Youngstown, and at the same time, a place where deindustrialization is still a cursed word, a banned word, a censored word. As it evokes a haunting past and an impossible future. But there are also historiographical reasons explaining why deindustrialization has not become yet a keyword and a shared perspective of research for Italian historians. Italian labor historiography has been deeply militant, politicized, always standing on the workers' side. Italian historians have not overstepped the cycle of contention of the 1970s, the peak of a mature working class. That's probably why, or one of the reasons why, the unmaking of that working class, its exit from scene, and combativeness, and the consequences of that couldn't be approached as a subject of historical research, as it was a matter of a political defeat. So I would provokingly say that Italian deindustrialization hasn't been as much socially traumatic as politically disorienting. And to conclude, what I have roughly described is rapidly changing, and in more recent times, particularly after the Great Recession of 2008, deindustrialization is becoming a broadening field of research, not a topic, but a methodological approach to labor history, to renovate labor history after a long crisis, I think. But Italian historians have a very busy schedule, and much work has to be done on chronology, steps, actors, places, struggles, resistances, and finally memory and representations of what has been called the vanishing of industrial Italy. And I'm convinced that it would be important, this work, also to better understand the industry and the industrial working class, or the class ouvrière who is left, and whose reality and future is not questioned by the study of deindustrialization. So I would like to reassure workers and unionists that while studying deindustrialization, we are not saying that the working class doesn't exist anymore. Thank you.